welcome our esteemed panel here tonight. And actually, who better to introduce them than themselves? So Ruth, we'll start with you first.
Well, good evening, everybody. Really nice to see so many faces. Am I looking?
You're on. Are you on?
Can everyone hear me?
I can hear you.
You can hear me. Okay. So yes, thank you, Darren.
Yeah.
Basically, a little bit about me. My background is in fashion design. I studied fashion design in NCAD, and when I finished NCAD, I worked in an Irish fashion business, which is in the heart of the Black Pits Newmarket Square in Dublin. And over time, I started moving into styling, and I had always a passion for fashion history and for vintage. And with this passion, I decided to move to London, and when I was in London, I did a master's in the history and culture of fashion. And when I was there, being in London, a lot of the time people are often kind of saying, you know, oh, in Dublin there's no style and you don't have any designers, and this is kind of driving me crazy, you know. And because I had a big passion in fashion, or in history and in fashion, and I'd read all my Irish fashion history books, and you know, obviously being immersed in the fashion world, that was kind of a burning mission for me to write a thesis about Irish fashion history and the fact that we were stylish, and I had things to prove it. So,
where does it begin actually in terms of Irish fashion? I mean, where did you focus on?
Well, obviously in Ireland we've got a fraught history. So the kind of Anglo-Irish debate and things like that, which I won't go into, don't worry. But where does fashion history begin? That was a big question for me when I was looking at my research, and that's why I decided to use South William Street, which was originally the rag trade street of Dublin, as a basis for my thesis. When I worked in that old factory in Newmarket Square, all of the people that I was working with told me stories of South William Street and how it was the rag trade street of Dublin, and how so many designers started their trade there. So with all these different things that were happening, you know, my experience working in Dublin, living in London, and everyone saying, there's no fashion in Dublin, this kind of put together a thesis and an idea to study Irish fashion history and just use South William Street as a model. How, what were we doing, what kind of fashion were we producing, and as I continued to study it, I studied the street in terms of its kind of architectural history, its fashionability, and then what businesses were there, and it brought through a fashion cycle the fact that it's now a street to hang out on. It's now a street where if you buy something cool in one of the independent stores or pop-up shops or vintage stores that are on the street, you will more than likely end up hanging out in a restaurant or a cafe on South William Street. So that's that story of cycles.
But that's the thing, is you actually discovered that, when I wasn't aware of this, that South William Street was a hub of clothing fabrication and manufacturing back in the early 1900s.
It started in the 1900s. The street originally was like a beautiful residential street for the 18th century. 19th century, it was a merchant street. I don't know if you're familiar with Dublin or South William Street, but it's a really kind of, an interesting, charming street. It's a little bit run down, but all the buildings are 18th century. Mm-hmm. So it began as a fashionable place to live. Then it became a merchant street, but it was like top-notch merchants that were like supplying the Viceregal Lodge and things like that. And then as it went into the 1900s and the 20th century, it became a really convenient place to make fashion that was sold on Grafton Street. So people were in, you know, one-room businesses. People were there were furriers and bootmakers and hat makers and dressmakers, all in the kind of different rooms that you still see today in the Georgian buildings on the street. And then for further into the 20th century, bigger factories appeared, and big manufacturers, and particularly one amazing designer who was called Jack Clark. He had a factory in the 1950s and 60s. It was called Jack Clark, county wear or country wear. He had different labels, and it was Irish couture coats that were using Donegal tweed and beautiful Irish fabrics that were made with Irish fabrics, but French design, and then he would have sold it to Harrods in London and Lord and Taylor in New York.
Okay.
So it was kind of South William Street to Fifth Avenue. So fashion on the world stage, designers producing, world-class design on a street that no one really
that we now all sit down and drink coffee on. And obviously, so that's one part of your work, is the historian side of you. Obviously, you've worked as a stylist, as a designer. You also worked, and probably still do, as a fashion writer. Some of the UK-based sites you worked for?
Yeah, so when I finished my research, I was very immersed in writing, and I was also immersed in retail, so I kind of combined those two things, and I worked for matchesfashion.com, which is a luxury retailer.
Who doesn't know what matchesfashion.com is? That's okay, we'll forgive you. Yeah, it's fabulous clothes.
Check
basically.
It out,
yeah, really nice stuff.
So I used to write for them, all their editorial, all their magazines, and launch their blogs, and then that moved on to Liberty of London. I was their online editor, and again launched all their blogs and wrote their magazines and online content. And it was kind of fashion historian's dream working there, because it's like working in a beautiful manor house with like amazing archives, and your meeting rooms were like oak panelled drawing rooms. I don't know if anyone's been to Liberty of London, but it's a beautiful kind of oak department store right in the centre of London.
It's a gorgeous experience just even to walk around and let alone buy anything if you can afford to. Thanks, Ruth. And then Pauline, over to you. So Pauline brings a completely different angle and aspect to this, which I'm particularly intrigued about.
Okay, so, sounds loud after. My name is Pauline Garvey. I make no claims to be fashionable whatsoever. I'm an anthropologist from NUI Maynooth. And the reason I'm here, I think, is because I have an interest in material culture. And anthropology is the study of humans and how humans make culture with whatever is to hand. My particular area of specialization is material culture, how we use objects, houses, domestic spaces, and clothing as a way of expressing ourselves, expressing our values, our aspirations, our status symbols or whatever, from the dawn of humankind right up to now. My area of, my topic of specialization is domestic homes, domestic spaces, furniture. I'm writing a book about IKEA. Keep an eye out, it'll be out in the next year or two. I had to plug that. But I've also taught a few courses about cloth and the anthropology of cloth. So that's recycling, or it's looking at clothing and how we can use, how a piece of cloth can be a flashpoint for controversy, debate, stereotyping, labels. I've just finished teaching a course about the hijab, or the veil, or the headscarf, whatever people call it, in London, in Paris, and how one small piece of cloth can be kind of overloaded symbolically, so that women who wear the hijab are, kind of labeled as passive or victims or shackled to their religion, whereas a lot of them see themselves as modern, progressive, fashionable young Londoners. So how, some small pieces of cloth can kind of project a whole series of social controversies, and that's why I'm interested in it. And I'm moving it more in that direction, just to look at clothing and cloth as a social skin, how we use clothing as something that's intensely personal, but also something that's intensely social, and in ways that we can't always fully control, ways that kind of we can be labeled by what we wear in ways that we don't like, or sometimes we can see ourselves as a particular type of person, but others might not see us in that way. So some of these sort of ways through which clothing, cloth, fashion become intensely cultural and intensely social and intensely personal at the same time, and some of the conflicts that arise from that.
I think that's really interesting, because actually what we're going to see is many of the trends that have come back, and the second wave or the third wave of the trend over maybe 20, 30 years, the references, I guess, or the connotations of what people might be wearing have completely changed, taken out of context of time, which is quite interesting. I mean, just look at power dressing, for instance, of the 1980s. It was all about, femininity, asserting yourself, asserting your place in the workplace, whereas take, a pencil skirt or power shoulders, transport them to today, women are wearing them because they're rather fabulous and they've got great legs and they look great in a pencil skirt, or whatever it is you want it to be. It's kind of, the connotations of it have been left and it's moved on. So before we get into all that, I'm interested to know, obviously, the idea, when we talk about the idea of cycles in fashion, you, Ruth, what does it mean to you?
The cycle of fashion
Cycles and fashion, yeah, when we talk about this kind of cycles and what are they?
It opens up a whole thing because it's the idea of the whole fashion business is based on a cycle, and it's the cycle of the 2 seasons. But with the speed of trends and things like that, I think cycles have changed, and retailers have been the catalyst for the change as well. I think the speed in which we can get a new idea or a dress, or that we've seen a celebrity wear, I think has changed how fast the cycle works. If you go back to the 80s, perhaps a trend would take longer to kind of disperse and for people to have access to it. And then obviously going back to the 40s and 50s, it's much slower in how a trend is, or a cycle moves. So I think what's exciting for us is the speed in which it's going, and that's interesting to look at, because I think in the past, because it was much slower, we could really sit down and analyse it, and now we're in a very different period.
And actually, Pauline, that's quite interesting, because I mean, if you look at how a piece of clothing can be symbolic or can unite a group of people or separate people, or, you know, obviously going back to 30, 40 years ago, ideas spread slower than they do today.
I think there's a few things at play. One is that clothing is now seen as disposable in ways that it wasn't after the Second World War, for example. So there's this huge acceleration of, you know, clothing being bought and just been moving and people changing all the time. And that has accelerated tremendously in the last few decades. And it leads to, you know, huge mountains of cloth where, you know, that are being exported. Now it's a vast industry and all the rest. So there's that on the one hand, but there's also, I suppose we'll be talking about it later on, what's called style tribes, that there is no kind of one dominant style any longer, but there's a whole series of different tribes and youth cultures and subcultures, and people feeling that they can express themselves a bit more and choose more and feel like it's more within their control. So it's less...
Has that not always been the case, though? I mean, if you look back to, say, the punk age of the 70s and Vivienne Westwood and, you know, Tartan, and they were really roughing it up, and, you know, that was an expression of their individuality and they were going against the system. Has that not always been the way with fashion?
Well, no, not really. Not since after the Second World War, I think it was much more dominated. And this is probably, again, what we'll see in a little while, that there was much more kind of authority, and there was much more emphasis on authority and people saying what is in fashion. And you even had advertisers in the 50s speaking in really sort of insulting ways about consumers, saying there's Mr. Moron, Mrs. Moron, and the little morons. You know, so you had this sort of tremendous idea that advertisers and marketers could tell people what was fashionable and people would accept that. Whereas from the 60s, 70s, or, you know, 60s and 70s at least, it's much more diversified, and you don't find that sort of dominance to the same degree at all. There's much more emphasis on people choosing and making their own choices and seeing it as part of their own biography and expressing and understanding themselves through their clothing.
Is that just big business, though? Is that just kind of like we need, you know, we've H&M, Pennies, all these stores that literally, in order to, you know, make the bottom line and increase their profits, they just keep churning them around, they just keep going, you know, every 6 weeks we're going to have a new cycle of fashion. We're just going to keep it going, so it's kind of self-perpetuating?
Yeah, big business does certainly infiltrate, and it's a huge industry. It's a huge industry. But we all need clothing, we all wear clothes. And I think anthropologists have realized for a long time that, yes, there is a functional aspect and utilitarian aspect to clothing, but you cannot really, beyond the bare essentials, look at it only in terms of practicalities. There's no functional reason why men's clothing buttons to the right and women's buttons to the left. You know, and that's something, if any of you are wearing shirts now, you'll see that women's clothing tends to button towards the left-hand side of their body and men's to the right. There's no practical functional reasons. It's, you know, there's a tremendous sort of symbolic system behind all of that as well. And people are using it creatively as well as the infiltration from the industry. So it's not one or the other. You have to look at all sides, I think.
If we look at clothes, and by all means, I know Diane said this at the beginning, if you've any questions, participate. It's an open dialogue, so please feel free to chime in. We've got a mic as well. Ruth, if we take it back to cycles, and I mean some of the clothing that we've seen across maybe the past 100 years, I mean, what key pieces, if you were to give some examples, what key pieces would you say, you know, have definitely gone through 1, 2, possibly going into their third cycle?
Kind of key items from decades and things like that. Wow.
Because it's quite
There's
funny.
so many.
There is, but like right now, we're still in a phase where it's skinny jeans. In skinny jeans, it's just like a mega cycle that has just, it's probably over 10 years now. Whereas obviously you look to the 70s and it's about, you know, kick flares or bootleg and high-waisted, and up until maybe 4 or 5 years ago, any self-professed fashionista wouldn't be seen dead in a pair of flared jeans. And now it's slightly starting to kind of turn again. It's more acceptable, kind of coming back to what you said there, Pauline, to kind of these micro tribes within tribes, and people aren't as rigid. But what is it about, let's say, flared jeans that will eventually bring them back?
Well, I think what the fashion cycle works as it's kind of the life cycle of a product. When something is really, you know, a hot item or really fashionable, it's nearly kind of connected with the fact that not many people have it. It's an exclusivity. And if it's an item that's like really out of fashion or really dated, it's nearly like someone will, a very brave fashion person will take this item on and really wear it. I think maybe the Barber jacket could be a good example, like Alexa Chung. It was a real classic item, something someone wore horse riding, or if it's really cold weather, and then she kind of wears it in an ironic way and brings it. It's kind of like, oh, not sure, but she's wearing it, yes. And then it kind of moves, the cycle kind of moves.
So would that be the beginning?
So the beginning, you've got someone who adopts an item that's so way out of fashion that it's nearly interesting again, you know. And I think it's definitely down to interest, because we as humans want new ideas, and we want to see something new, and that fashion business is so based on that. Like, we want new color, we want new style. So it's like that item that's just a little bit so wrong, it's right, and then it moves into mainstream. Maybe a celebrity takes it on, maybe a band looks really cool wearing it, and it kind of infiltrates into culture. You know, obviously the retailers snap onto it pretty quickly, and a trend kind of emerges.
Does it have to be someone who's considered very, very trendy, to use a word, or very influential? Because you could take like two different people. I mean, obviously, if Victoria Beckham wears something, people automatically sit up and take notice and maybe start to replicate what she's wearing. If it's someone like Katie Price or Jordan, you know, also known as Jordan, who starts wearing something, I mean, presumably that can have the opposite effect.
Of course, and I mean, it's not always brought into motion via a celebrity. That was just kind of an example, but I think it has to come into motion. Someone will bring on a new idea, but it's also to do with culture, what's happening at that time, you know, what do people want, how are people feeling, and sort of a mixture of all of those different ideas connected with, you know, this amazing person looking fabulous in this item, and then it's just...
But in order for it to come back, it has to have completely died, disappeared, and gone off the radar.
Yes.
Like, it can't just keep bubbling
and
away.
There is certain items, I think. I mean, I'm a 90s girl, so at the moment there's a cycle of that coming back, and there's some of those things that I was just like, I'm never wearing that again. And then you see them like, oh, maybe it's creeping back.
I have a question. Who in this room considers the 90s retro?
Don't say it.
Oh, okay. Now I'm starting to feel very old. Right. So that's an interesting thing as well. It's like, how much does point of reference come into what you consider, you know, another cycle or something actually being labelled as retro? I mean, everything these days is retro or vintage inspired. Where do we begin, and what's the cutoff?
Well, it's a generation thing as well, you know. But again, with the speed of everything, we're kind of using the 20th century as a dress-up box and just, you know, pillaging what we want from it. But I definitely think it's a generation thing as well, because in the 90s I was mad about my mum's 70s clothes, and obviously people now are kind of fascinated. It's a nostalgia, and I think you were talking about that before as well, Pauline. You're looking back to another time, and you look at pictures of your parents, your grand, and you're like, they were having an amazing time and they looked incredible, you know. And then they tell you some story that they weren't having an amazing, you know. You kind of have this nostalgia or romance about it. Old clothes or vintage clothes.
Yeah, I think I mean, nostalgia seems to be one of these things that is ubiquitous and pervasive now, and the whole idea of nostalgia. Well, actually, if you look back at the history of the whole idea of nostalgia, it goes back hundreds of years, but it's really since, the last couple of 100 years since the Industrial Revolution and all the rest, where people have started looking at the past as something that is better than the present and is better than the situation that we're in today. So nostalgia in the last 100 years, and I suppose constantly accelerating, is this idea that the good old days were always better, and we're kind of constantly have this feeling. And the more, I suppose, disenchanted we get with what it is to be modern and the present day, the more that we kind of project back on the past as providing us with something that is lost. So there is this sort of pervading feeling of, what is lost. Mm-hmm. And I suppose anthropology has a certain amount of that, and archaeology and a lot of the disciplines developed as this feeling that we've lost something, humans have lost something. So yeah, that works its way into fashion.
Would that explain, because kind of riding along at the same time, we had this massive explosion of high-end or fast fashion, affordable clothing, just, explosion. Like literally, there's a Pennies on every corner, there's a H&M. But at the same time, you had an explosion in vintage stores and interest in vintage. Is that, can those two things exist equally, or can you separate the two?
I think vintage exists. Well, the kind of vintage has now become mainstream. It had a kind of different life before. There was always sort of an interest, like you're saying, a nostalgic interest in an antique clothes or beautiful objects, more like kind of an art object. And now it becomes a mainstream, and it's kind of infiltrated into fashion, I think, now. And I think it has accelerated because of fast fashion, because there's so many mass products out there. It was a way of being individual and a way of finding, no one else has this item. It has a history to it. There's a story, there's a romance. And like you were saying, that you're kind of looking back and thinking, we've lost something. And I think with fashion for a while, it was like we've lost the glamour, and you would get that back a little bit with vintage fashion.
Depends where you shop, I guess.
Yeah.
Some vintage stores you go in and you rifle through the rails, and what they're selling as vintage has a St. Bernard tag on it, which for anyone who doesn't know what St. Bernard is, it's the label that Dunnes Stores kind of ran or used to run. So not that old, but they were pawning it off as vintage.
And nostalgia
is
to that too, right?
Nostalgia to St. Bernard and Yellow Pack? Yeah, it's something I certainly won't be going back to.
I think though in the era of mass production, where everything is accelerating and disposable, and there's just this dizzying array of goods all around us, there's this sort of need for us to kind of singularize ourselves and specify that we're different and we're not part of this mass, and that's why we always try and find something that is more unique to us and something that stamps us out as separate. Or we develop hobbies, stamp collecting or something. We try to pinpoint and find, and it often is in a piece of clothing, because a clothing is worn on the body. It's something very close to the body. It's part of our person in a more fundamental way than maybe ordinary possessions, because it takes the shape of our body. So clothing often becomes that point through which we specify, I'm an individual, I'm unique, or whatever. And I think it's no coincidence that we use clothing to kind of separate the person and think of ourselves as unique. And there's all these cliches about the jilted lover. They attack the clothing of the person, if they've been their boyfriend's gone and slept with something. It's always the shirts and the ties. And it's not coincidence that it's the clothing, because it is really a part of the person in a more fundamental way than almost anything else. And that's why when we want to institutionalize people, we give them uniforms, we take away their own individual clothing. So clothing and what we wear is kind of an extension of the body in ways. And that's why I think that we particularly look to clothing as a way of trying to express something singular about ourselves and something special about ourselves. And vintage might be part of this process now, but now it is becoming mainstream, to try and find something that isn't part of the mass in the same way.
Why is that important to us?
I think it's important to us because, well, firstly, it's expected of us. The whole emphasis on individualism isn't something universal and hasn't always been there, and is something that is particularly situated in these, Western time and place or whatever. We're expected to be individuals, and we're expected to be unique, and we're kind of, that's part of what it is to be a modern person now. So I think we are expected to choose a biography and express ourselves is something separate and unique, and that there's a lot of pressure on people to do that as well. But it's not just something that we're expected, it's about how we understand ourselves and how we, relate to other people, and how we situate ourselves in relation to other people. So there's something kind of fundamentally human about it as well.
And Pauline, you mentioned something earlier on about nostalgia and looking back to a time where, we thought it was better or whatnot. When, in terms of clothing and fashion, do you think that actually began? Or have we always done it through the decades?
Yes.
And the centuries even?
Yeah, so actually if you look at the history of the word fashion, it used to, up to about 16th century, to fashion was to make. It was the process of making. And all of the sort of medieval debates about, what Christians wear and what the clergy wear and all that, if anyone is aware of these things, clothing wasn't just about representing yourself or expressing yourself. There was nothing superficial about it. You were the type of person. Of person depending on the clothing you wore. So it was against the law to wear clothing outside of your social station. Mm-hmm. So it was tremendously important. So the idea of fashion and clothing as not only representing who we'd like to be, but identifying who we are, is something that's been there for hundreds of years. But now fashion has taken on another resonance where it's not just about making the person, but it's about kind of quick, superficial change, something that changes constantly. So there's this double-edged idea of what fashion is. Firstly, it's something that's constantly changing and is corporate and everything that we, all the rest. But it's also, we use the word fashion about making a person, making something, to fashion something. So we're aware that we are the type of clothing, we are a particular type of person depending on the clothing we wear. And so if I came in here and I said I'm a goth or I'm a punk, nobody would take that seriously because I'm not wearing the clothing of a goth or a punk. So you have to...
Secret life, maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
Weekends.
But without the ability to express yourself through your clothing, your whole idea of yourself can be frustrated. It can be very profound if it's frustrated and when it's frustrated.
How much can we control what people perceive of us through what we're wearing? I mean, that's the thing. You can't control what someone else thinks of you. So even though you might think you're dressed appropriately for the office, for college, for whatever it might be, you could be sending it all the wrong signals, but you're blissfully unaware.
Exactly. So one of the first things I say to my students is clothing as easy to read? Is fashion as easy to read as we're told? Is it just simple, that people understand you as you want them and expect them to understand you? So maybe the audience would like to do this. I get my students to look the person on their right up and down. Give them a good look, from head to toe. Don't be shy, just stare them up and down and just give them a good look. And, could you read this person? Are they, identifying themselves as they expect? It's a lot more difficult once you start doing it. So there's a lot of room. There's a lot of room for misjudging, misreading.
They're having some great fun with
They're
that.
enjoying it. They always enjoy that one, yeah.
It's not a matchmaking exercise, by the way, just in case anyone's wondering.
Clever.
It is quite clever. How much, and just a kind of a side note on that, colour in terms of anthropology?
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked me about this because it's absolutely fascinating. It's something that we don't think about very much, or texture, or the feel. And this is, I suppose, again, anthropology. We look not just at the shapes of clothing or the fashions, but we look at the colours and the textures and how the body feels. Because being comfortable is social as well as personal. If people all around you are deeply uncomfortable by what you're wearing, you won't be comfortable yourself. But you can extend it even further. Like in India, the colour isn't just something that represents how you feel. The colour can affect you. So people believe that wearing certain textures or certain colours can make them more spiritual or more fertile or more virile. So the colour can actually, in some places, affect how people... It affects their body. It makes them able to have children, or by wearing particular...
But that's a perceived effect, obviously.
Well...
Okay, that's another issue, right.
So the colour in various different places, if colour makes you more spiritual or more virile or more whatever, then it's something extremely profound. It affects the person. Now, I don't think in Ireland we'd have this idea by wearing red, it makes us more whatever, but it makes us feel that way and perhaps act that way. And if it makes us act that way, then it is making us in that way more...
Well, it is quite interesting, actually, colour, because, I mean, straight away, if someone says they're wearing a red dress, instantly you start to think it's kind of sexy, it's vampy, it's, you know, it's a bold colour. And I think if you even bring it back to like in marketing spheres, red is seen as a colour that's a call to action. Psychologically, it's been shown that, you know, if you want to encourage your whoever you're marketing to make an action, red is a good colour. And actually, complete aside, I remember at the time, Aer Lingus went through, obviously after 9/11, this really disastrous time where they couldn't sell seats. They had to rebrand. They were perceived as being expensive, being top end, being, you know, you're going to pay top dollar. You might remember when they started about repositioning their brand, the key colours they chose were red and yellow. Given that their brand identity is green, was quite interesting. Red being the colour that is a call to action. It entices you to do something. So does the same apply to what we wear?
Yep.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
And what about blue for, like, you know, you said wear something blue when you're getting married.
What's wrong with wearing blue?
Complete
I wear
random
blue. I wear
question.
blue.
No, but don't they say something blue, something borrowed, and
yeah,
something,
yeah.
you know, where does that come from?
Superstition.
Superstition. Okay, so superstition versus, so I'm presuming superstition is a big part of what you study in cultures and clothing.
Belief systems. Belief systems, I suppose, or superstitions,
And rituals and things as well.
Yeah.
Because dressing is such a ritual that I suppose dressing for a wedding there's this very specific ritual for that.
Who looks at getting dressed as a ritual? Hands up. Okay, so that's a fifth of the room. And for everyone else, what is it? A function?
What about getting dressed to go out? Is that a ritual?
Right. And how does it different than getting dressed just for everyday wear versus the ritual of getting dressed up to go out? More time. Perception. What do you mean by that?
I mean, when you go out with friends, you obviously take care of yourself more than you do for everyday clothing. And you know that people look at you a different way. Because going out always is kind of a matchmaking thing.
You just answered my next question. Who are you dressing for? Okay.
It is, I mean, you have to be more careful of how people perceive you, I think.
Interesting. So that's come and bring it back to...
I think a lot of it, we tend to think of clothing and fashion as something that's only an individual thing, but actually it's much more about social relationships than we actively consider. But I'd like to ask the audience, how many people have something in their wardrobe that they have never worn or will never wear? Or maybe they wore it once, but they'll never wear it again, but they cannot bear to throw it out. Yeah,
okay,
me
that's
too.
That's a good 80%.
So we all have things that are part of our person in one way or another, our person past, our person future, our aspirational person, things that we cannot bear to get rid of, maybe. But they are, and it just shows how clothing is not just functional. It's about, all right, maybe I'll never wear this, but I can't get rid of it because it's, you know, who I would like to be, or
a size 8.
Maybe,
that type of thing.
Maybe.
I mean, I don't know. Does anyone, because it's quite interesting to see how, I mean, we're talking about how fashion comes around in cycles, and, you know, are we effectively saying that keep something long enough and it'll eventually come back in fashion?
I think it will, but I think the item will be used in a totally different way, and it might not be exactly the way that it was worn before, so maybe it's not a good idea to keep it.
Right. So, I mean, you know, power shoulders, shoulder pads. Obviously, the first time round, they had a very specific goal and aim. It was, you know, strong, present, you're here. Lady Gaga wore shoulder pads not so long ago, and different people have been spotted wearing shoulder pads. If we look at shoulder pads and assume they're going to come back as a trend, what is it saying then about us, or what's it saying about the people wearing them, given the situation has changed?
Sometimes I think it's just playfulness, and perhaps, like I was saying earlier, it's the life cycle of something that's been away for a long time that suddenly becomes interesting. Could have been sparked by something, or It can be just, designers being playful with something that they've seen, or maybe it's a film that
Are they
came
being
back.
playful or lazy?
No, I think like there's different. For example, David Bowie or David Bowie, however you pronounce it, he's returned as a big style icon because there's a lot of talk about it. There's a lot of exhibitions about it, and it will have a big effect, I think, on fashion. So there's certain people at certain times kind of connect with what's happening. I don't think it's always out of nowhere. I think it.
How predictable are these cycles?
As predictable as people are, not very predictable.
Right, but yet what's interesting is everyone has a kind of reference point of about 20 years back. Like you referenced the 90s, kind of that you've a nostalgia for the 90s. Everyone would seem to work back a little bit. Would 20 years be, why would 20 years be important?
No, I don't know, actually. I wouldn't know about those specific cycles in fashion because I haven't, I don't know enough about fashion.
Okay.
but I would know that once something becomes fashionable, as soon as it's labelled fashion, it means its time is limited. We only call things fashion when we know they're going to. When we know
there goes my wardrobe.
When we know they're going to die out. So the whole idea of fashion is something that is going to die. If it's not.
And on that note, have a lovely evening. No.
If it's not that, then we don't call it fashion.
Okay, right. So a whole different debate then is fashion versus style.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. We got to talk. That's another day's conversation. Right, we are going to have a look at some fashions. We have Fleur, the lovely lady here in pink, from the Trinity College Fashion Society, and they very kindly assembled a couple of different looks. And Fleur, you're going to talk us through them, and we can ask you questions, I'm assuming, and the audience can as well?
You can ask me questions.
Not saying you have all the answers, but we will talk about them anyway.
So these looks are actually from Lulu Vintage Store in Monkstown. I picked them out with Veronique, my boss lady, who owns the store, and we really like them. This is Veronique here. So she'll actually, she'll kill me if I say she'll answer your questions. But they're actually all up for sale as well. So if you really, really like them, talk to her afterwards. But our first model here is Nicola. She is in a vintage 60s Pucci shift dress. And she looks gorgeous. Do you want to step up here?
So vintage 60s.
Yeah, Pucci.
It is gorgeous.
Yeah.
So in terms of, Ruth, you might be the best one for this question. In terms of what makes this synonymous with the 60s, what kind of key details would you point out?
Particularly the colour and the kind of swirling, almost psychedelic patterns. I think they're very connected with what the 60s were all about. That kind of explosion of colour. It was a generation after World War II. The baby boomers, they're kind of coming into coming of age and living in a generation where everything was grey and everything was rationed. And I think the kind of idea of colour and pattern kind of sums up what was happening. But then again, like we were talking about earlier, you've got a designer like Pucci who's a genius with pattern and producing dresses like this at the same time seems almost, it can't be a coincidence. But I actually think the pattern is very relevant for today as well. Because we've had a couple of seasons of really incredible pattern work from people like Peter Pilotto and Mary Catranzu. So I actually think this dress is really relevant for today. It's got.
So for you, Fleur, what was it about this dress that kind of, I won't even say nostalgic because it's not nostalgic for you, but in terms of.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those statement pieces. I mean, if you wear it, people will look at you. Pucci is really like that, isn't it? It's all about making the entrance. I think it was just a really great dress that was in the shop. I thought it would be a great conversation piece. I think it really represents the 60s, like the shape and the pattern.
Well, that's it. I think you've hit the nail on the head. The shape, specific, like for me, is the 60s. Yeah. It's that kind of A-line. It's not too clingy. It's not too baggy, but it's very comfortable. It's easy to wear. You've got that sleeve coverage, so it is quite demure, high neckline, and the length as well, which is quite interesting because you're showing some leg, but you're not. It's not sexy in that way. And then the shorter heel, the kitten heel. Hi.
I was just going to ask. Obviously, this sort of dress and style is very predominant now in terms of fashion. How much much of that do you think is due to cultural things like Mad Men, that sort of influence, and how much of it do you think is just the cycle coming back around again?
Who wants to take that? I mean, my tuppence worth on that is, I think definitely shows like Mad Men, which become kind of pop cultural phenomenons, do permeate, and it kind of comes back to what you were saying, Pauline, about reaching a huge number of people and having a great effect. I also think a lot of it has to do with as well people being jaded by, you know, this size 6 model waif, skinny jeans, you know, where it's not really reflective of what women are. And actually, so it's a couple of things. It was timing, it was the fact that it was so popular, and the fact that actually it embraced real women. And, you know, you had people like Joan, the flame-haired secretary, who was, you know, a buxom lady who celebrated her curves but was never considered tacky or, you know, cheap or kind of nasty, which sometimes it can be. So that's what it is for me. But I mean, what do you guys think? Pauline, what would you say?
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I don't think it's either one or another. I think things like Mad Men obviously have an effect because they're influential, but I don't think that men or women are duped either, and that we follow completely slavishly what we see around us in the media. But I think it is certainly influential, and people are reaching out and looking for ways of being different or being individual, then they choose these. I wonder though how mainstream this type of dress is.
Now or in the past?
Yeah, now.
Well, just to answer the question you were saying as well about sort of how, you know, culture and
Is it due for a recycle anyway, or is it pushed along by?
Yeah, I think sometimes as a consumer we kind of think designers are kind of, they're, you know, forcing this idea down, or it's just something they've thought of. But if you think of a designer, they're immersed in a culture as well, and very often they are very artistic, and they're very influenced by culture and art and fashion and other things that are happening in the world. So I always think that nearly everything is coming from some kind of cultural event, and then it turns back into the cycle.
What's quite interesting though about Mad Men as well is the time when Mad Men reappeared, because it's kind of come along at the same time. It's been a parallel with the growth in vintage. So is it a chicken and egg situation that it's very hard to predict? We're talking about predicting cycles, and it's just a culmination of everything together. I think if you planned it in such a way, it would probably never happen. Yeah.
Okay, let's see what you guys think about the next piece, because we've actually got to move on.
Okay, just one last thing on this dress. You asked about, or someone said about, you know, how it influences what's on the high street today. It won't necessarily be a carbon copy, and that's the thing, because no one really wants to play dress up and look like they've just walked down, you know, Madison Avenue 1960s, but it's borrowing traits from it. So it'll be the length, it'll be the general cut. But actually, I was looking at A-line skirts and dresses today, and what I've noticed is the sleeves are slightly shorter. So even though the sleeve is still there, it might be to about here, and the neck I found was slightly longer on them. So it's just little modifications. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nicola. Sorry.
You're okay.
I'm being pressured to cut you off. So here we have Ellen. This is a vintage 80s Issey Miyake suit, and it's got a beautiful coat tail. It's a collector's piece. And you'll see, it's really gorgeous, and it's really really wearable piece. There you go.
That's lovely. So tell us, why did you choose this, and why do you think why it's in 80s?
I was told it was 80s, but I think it has got the shoulders. I mean, it doesn't have the shoulder pads, thank God. I think that would ruin it. But it is a little bit more, you know, big up here, but like the waist is tiny. It's actually a tiny suit, but it still gives her that big boss lady effect, I think. I think it's quite masculine, and I think sometimes that kind of that is the trend of the 80s, the more masculinity for the women. And
anyone in the audience remember this first time round? Yeah?
The pleated
yeah.
of the trousers and then the tapered ankle.
How does it make you, would you have worn it first time round? Yeah? How does it make you feel to see it now?
It's lovely, actually. I had a resonance to it and it made me smile. But I wouldn't wear it now.
Would you? Well, that's the interesting thing. So why wouldn't you wear it now? You've moved on. So that's the thing, Pauline. Is it only really like, will you ever go back to wearing it again, or is it just a different generation who will assume that look or style?
Well, I think I remember reading once that fashion is about provoking. It's about trying to push the boundaries of what's mainstream or what's viewed kind of morally correct or morally appropriate behaviour, whatever, and that fashion's always trying to push at those boundaries. So maybe it's more likely to be the youthful people moving up that are more likely to embrace that sort of more subversive aspect of fashion, whereas maybe older people or who've gone through that kind of don't feel that need to kind of push those boundaries anymore. So I think maybe that's why certain things seem more appropriate for young people and youth culture and subculture, all that, but maybe not for people who've done all that and have moved on. Maybe we're all kind of more mainstream and.
Is that the thing? Ruth, what does this outfit mean to you?
What I really like about it is the kind of there's the reference to it being masculine, but it is very feminine.
It is,
and it's
yeah.
when any woman wears a masculine suit, there's always that interplay between the two. And I love the frock coat detail, the kind of peplum at the back, and as well the pleating, but that does really date it. I think it does, not in a negative way. It does really make it very specific from that period.
It. But the interesting thing about that kind of whole androgynous look is it probably started much longer before the 80s. I mean, it was Marlene Dietrich who was kind of the first statement lady who would wear tux and that kind of really tailored masculine look, and then it's come back round. So I mean, from an anthropological point of view, that would be... Yeah,
but I think we associate the androgynous look far more with the 80s, don't we? Then, because we might think of the 70s as the more hippie thing, and there was the women's movement, and there was all of that was happening. So maybe the more androgynous look makes sense because there had been a whole sort of shift in women's position within society and so on and so forth, and clothing became another manifestation or expression of those changes. So I think it makes sense for that time, even though you do find examples,
Well, one thing I think is really interesting is the heels and the footwear. I mean, how, from your point of view, how does that date, or how does it kind of reference an area? Like, this is obviously, the other heel was kind of like a kitten heel. Here we've got kind of a stacked heel.
Well, yeah. The other heels were actually Bali, and they're from, I think they were 50s, so they weren't with the same era of the outfit. I wasn't literally translating.
No, but in terms of, still though, they do reference the time.
Yeah,
and that's the interesting thing about all these vintage looks. They're not necessarily, how people wear vintage today isn't just about kind of recreating a look or an era or a decade. It's kind of mixing it all up.
I think shoes are very important. You can look at lots of items that kind of work now, 70s, 40s, even 20s, a certain item, and it's always the shoes that it's a giveaway. You could wear it now. I would imagine in the 80s it probably was a flat with it, but it looks great. I did love the shoes. So for a modern look, it's cool.
It's a cool look. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ellen. So now our final look is Mona. She's wearing a really dramatic Balenciaga gown from what we think is the 70s. The really interesting thing about this gown, as you'll note, Balenciaga took a lot of inspiration from Spanish painters, and particularly Velázquez. I don't know if any of you know about that stuff, but you could really see it in his dress. So I thought it was a really interesting conversation topic because it really does represent the cycles of fashion in it. I mean, the empire waistline up here and everything. It's really, I'm sure you guys will see that.
It's a real statement.
It's a statement piece.
I mean, what's interesting to me about this is this seems like the least practical of any of the outfits in terms of, but a point and a place. And it's not a slight on it, but I'm just wondering in terms of fashion cycles, how would it affect the return of a trend? For instance, you couldn't really imagine yourself jumping on the bus going into town for a night out in a dress like this. It just wouldn't seem practical. Does that affect kind of how trends come and go?
Well, I think it affects in terms of comfort. As I said, comfort is both social and physical. And we tend to think of it only in terms of physical. But if you went to a lecture in that maybe, or if you went to whatever, you might think, oh, this is a lovely dress, but everyone else might think, God, they're really dressed inappropriately. So you might yourself feel very uncomfortable. So I think comfort, you need to think of it as something both social and individual. And that's why maybe these dresses, even though it's lovely, might be less likely
I think
We're
so used to comfort now as well, like in our clothes. And going back to the Mad Men thing of, women having lots of structure and girdles and things like that, and wearing dresses like that now, and original vintage, they're very uncomfortable. They're really difficult to wear. So that's why, once we've had comfort, we really realise that. Whereas at the time, they would, probably have grown up in similar underwear. So by the time people grew up and were young women, it was normal. They didn't realise what it was like to wear tracksuit bottoms or leggings or jeggings, or they didn't have anything to compare.
People, well, young women in particular, put themselves through what I can only imagine as torture by wearing 7, 8-inch heels. Like, that just can't be comfortable. I don't care what you say. You're out for a night, you're dancing, you're doing whatever, and you're wearing a 7-inch heel. That just can't be comfortable.
It's not comfortable. It just looks good.
Speaking from experience. Is that it, though? Is it all just about looking good? I mean, because we're saying comfort is a big thing, and it's affecting how trends come.
It's about feeling good, about feeling feminine, and if women have different expressions of that. Sometimes they like to wear pink, or sometimes they like to wear high heels, or sometimes they like to wear short skirts. It's about feeling, feminine, and it's different things for different people, but the heels would be one of those things. But heels seem to be making their way out, I think. You don't see them.
Controversial.
You don't see them.
Thank you very much. You let our lovely model go and change. Thank you. Am I correct in saying that heels originally started out with men wearing them? It was a men's fashion trend back in the 1600s. And
I think men and women.
Wasn't it the Persian horsemen or something who used to wear them, and then they came to Europe and the men adopted them because they were fantastic and gave you great height, and the women started wearing them and they were great for horse riding. And now, I mean, obviously
it's such a shame.
Do you think?
Yeah,
I think it's a blessing in disguise.
It's funny how that's kind of evolved, that there's such a no to it. But like that's
Could you ever see
the cycle of how things move?
But okay, so when's the last time we had men wearing heels? I mean, it's a good few hundred years. Could you ever see a return to men wearing heels? Tom Cruise. And Bono, he needs partial to a heel. But
this is the thing, like why do we think it's wrong for men to wear heels? It's part of our culture, or how we are in society. Like, if you kind of draw that out and go, well, what is wrong with them? It's nothing. It's just how masculinity is kind of expressed now. But that was really amazing. You were incredibly masculine to have heels on. It's just that we don't see it the same way today.
Yeah.
But can you add skirts for men? That's an interesting one. I mean, we're seeing the likes of Marc Jacobs now. He's in his skirt the whole time.
Yeah.
And how he styles it is quite masculine, but I mean, for a lot of men, they just see a skirt.
Yeah.
From your perspective, is it something you can imagine coming back?
Absolutely. I would rule nothing out. Absolutely nothing. But the thing is, I think this is why it's all becoming much more diverse now. I think fashion is becoming much more, people are experimenting far more and pushing the boundaries much more. Whereas back maybe in the 70s or 60s, it was far more mainstream and it was really strict. What men wore and what women wore was very tightly regimented, and there was very little room for expression, maybe, after the Second World War. And since that time, it's become a lot more diverse. But I think that's how, maybe back then in the post-war period, what a man wore was related to what women wore. Nothing was in isolation. It was masculine because it wasn't feminine, and it was feminine because it wasn't masculine. So the whole kind of the colour, the shape, the texture was all related to what the other gender was wearing, and that was how they were defined. Whereas now you find a far more mixing of those boundaries of what's masculine, what's feminine. There's far more emphasis on unisex. There aren't those strict definitions of women's roles and men's roles. So I think in clothing you'll find that absolutely much more mixing now, and moving forward it will too, probably.
It's the same what you were saying earlier about sort of dressing for your social order, and then it kind of is about dressing specifically with gender, and if you move into the other one it's seen as such a terrible thing. So anything can happen then, if people are dressing outside of their social order, which of course we are, if there is a social order of the same, in the same way. When you look back at history and patterns and things like that, that does make you believe that anything could happen.
Do you think these cycles are just going to perpetuate themselves?
Yes, because life is a cycle, and and how everything is set up is a cycle, nature. So with that, if it's following humans, fashion is following humans.
It's quite interesting. For some reason, I've started thinking of the Hunger Games. Has anyone seen the movie? Yeah, and so it's obviously set in a futuristic time, and all the men in the capital dress pretty much like the women. It's all quite outlandish, it's all quite feminine. I'm just wondering what that means. And on that note, has anyone got an answer?
Oh, I have an answer.
Oh.
No, I was going to say something you said earlier. I don't know if it's not on.
I can hear you. You're okay. We can hear you fine.
You said earlier about buttons having no practical reasons why men's are on one side, women's are on another, and it's just something that I thought actually tied into what we're saying now about gender, because the original reason is that while buttons originally were like a real sign of wealth, if you had clothes that could be buttoned, and while men and women both had dressers, women's dressers were much more kind of hands-on, for want of a better term. And so the reason that they're on the side that are for women is that it's easier to button somebody's clothes. That thing. And so, men having their clothes buttoned on the side would be kind of a funny thing and be sort of the gender role playing in stuff originally. So I wonder if maybe the thing of skirts, or maybe something not that quite drastic, but maybe we don't even realise we're doing things now that originally would have been kind of laughed at as being completely the opposite gender role. And if things like that will continue to happen again, another couple of 100 years, whether things that only men do now or only women do now will cross over.
So kind of like all will be forgotten and we'll start from scratch.
Maybe just slightly in some things. I mean, and then the heel for men, I thought about the Cuban heel, but you don't really see that so much, except maybe on the odd medallion man or something. I just wondered if there's anything else.
That's quite interesting.
Can I just say, just coming back, because I've heard that, saying, well, the reason that, men's clothing buttons to the right and women's to the left is because the servants and all the rest. But I don't think that actually, I think that's one explanation, but I don't think it's the full explanation, because a lot of men's trousers and women's trousers are still made that way. There's no reason for us necessarily to perpetuate something that may have had a reason in, the upper classes or whatever.
I was wondering though, whether it's something that's just kind of remained as that's the way it is.
Yeah.
I was wondering if there's anything else.
Any other examples?
That had an original reason or whatever, but we just don't do it anymore for that reason. It's just still the way it is.
Well, I guess if it's not broken, why?
I think it becomes kind of like a tradition in tailoring and things like that, and is a traditional way of making things, and it's passed down and down, and that becomes a feature of what a shirt or what a trouser is and things like that, and then they retain the features even if you don't use them anymore. I think it becomes kind of a craft thing, or it can.
Also, I think a lot of the physical world is gendered in ways we don't think about it, in ways that we really don't think about it, and sometimes it's expressed in our material world. And a lot of design historians, look at, how things have changed over time and all the rest. But you see it, once you start looking around, you see it everywhere, the gendering of our material world, like even the Volvo, that Volvo sign, the logo is the male symbol on it. And every time because we have a Volvo, I look at it going, why is a Volvo male? Why? And I'm sure they wouldn't say, well, it's meant for men or whatever. But lots of the world is gendered in kind of very subtle ways, and that's kind of an interesting question of how they come to be that way. But that's getting away from fashion.
Yeah, so. It's interesting. Good question. Any other questions? Hello.
So the way that we're
Hi. How are you?
We're seeing now that male models are skinnier and taller, and they don't have these male figures from the, let's say, the 60s or what we're looking. Even we have males modeling for women's catwalks. This one. And we also
Andrea
see
Pejek.
we also see that women in the catwalks and in the fashion editorials are just very tall, and they have no figure or not curves at all. Where in the 50s it was all the other way around. They had a lot of figures. Do you think it is also a cycle? Do you think we will go back to this?
Did everyone hear that question?
Yeah, the body, which is, I think, is extremely related to the fashion.
It's 100% true. There's an amazing book called Seeing Through Clothes, and it's about the history of fashion through the nude, because it's just showing the shape of the body and the fashions in terms of your body, the shape that is fashionable of the time. That kind of Rubenesque time where the larger lady was like the most seen as the most beautiful, and then and across the board going through all the centuries, and then even now, people say it's kind of the period of the internalized corset that everyone has to look like. We don't have the corsets to pull us in, but we have to look like we have that shape already. So definitely there's cycles within the body and fashion obviously working together, and how we should look.
I think the cycles as well, I mean, from what I've read on it, and it's definitely not a science, but those cycles are often reflective of other things happening in the world. So for instance, you mentioned like at the beginning of 2000, it was all about androgynous, really like men who looked like boys, that kind of shape. They'd no real shape to them. It was just very straight up and down. They could wear anything. And, you know, see them in the dark, by all means, it could have been a female model or a male model. They were just shapeless. And then as the economy kind of got worse, the global economy got worse, we started to see kind of more masculine looking male models. I mean, David Gandy being the archetypal. I mean, there was a time where he couldn't get any work. When he started out as a model, which I think was about 2003, 2004, he was still an Adonis looking man, but he couldn't get work because all the big fashion houses didn't want big, strong, manly men. They wanted these, you know, androgynous looking shapes. And then there was slowly a shift and a change, and you know, some people say it's the economy, some people say perhaps it was boredom, perhaps it was just another cycle, and it has to go through these stages. But now, you know, if you look at a lot of men's fashion advertisements and advertorials, they're bigger men, they're muscular men, so it kind of goes back to, you know, what would have been more acceptable in a sense to maybe the 50s and 60s where men were men. Now obviously they're not the same shape, they're much more finessed, I guess would be the word, but it's interesting to see what influences that, and I've no doubt that it will continue to go in cycles like the fashion. Hi.
Hi, just wondering, talking about the cycles, I'm just wondering that, say during the Second World War, because you've referenced it a lot tonight, during that time people would have had clothing rations, so the skirt that you got at the beginning of the war was probably a blouse by the end of it, but you still had the same cloth. And then Dior launched that famous range where it was all pleats and excessive fashion after the war. I suppose what I'm wondering is, in years to come, I mean, a lot of the fabric that we have, you were saying, is disposable. We are a heavily oil-based economy at the moment. It's going to run out. A lot of our plastic for clothing as such, and there's cotton threads. So would it be a case that economy and energy dictates our fashion?
I think it will in the future. I think it's a very big point, and I think a lot of retailers are starting to think about the ethical side, not just to be nice, like you always put the question over it. I'm sure it's great for marketing, it's great for branding, but it's also because of their resources that it might not be possible to get that quantity of cotton or whatever it is that they're trying to source. So I think it's going to be very important for the fashion business, and who knows, because like you were saying earlier, there's so much produced like never before, mountains and mountains of fabric. And at the other end, you know, there's retailers like M&S talking about landfill and the amount of clothing that just is going into landfill and can be used for other things. So I think definitely the industry is going to have to address it. I know some retailers are starting to, but it's definitely a big area of focus.
I was just, sometimes I think you see this, like not just in vintage, but instead of recycling, they talk about upcycling or trashing instead of fashion. You know, so this whole sort of realization that there's a huge mountains of cloth out there, and it's now a very big industry as well, but it's trying to use that, and it's kind of tagging on to the vintage thing or exporting. There's vast amounts of saris or whatever being exported, you know, across the world and being made into fashionable items or cushions or whatever. So you have this sort of generation from things that had been recycling, had been rubbish at one point, you know, having whole other lives as cushions or as, you know, clothing in high street shops, you know, in Britain and Ireland or throughout Europe or wherever.
Yeah. It's actually quite interesting. There was a book that was released after, I think it was the Second World War, called, I think it's Sew and Save by Joanna Trollope. and it was re-released. I don't even know if the lady's around anymore, but it was re-released in, I think, 2006, 2007, in the height of the recession, and it was #1 selling book for like months on months, which is quite interesting. It was all about kind of how you can give your clothes another life, and knit this sleeve, do this, and you can get another garment out of it. So I think that type of thing as well is gonna, and it ties into that whole thing of being unique and individual, and so even if it's fast fashion, a few tweaks here and there makes it something that's unique to you.
But it's the cycle as well of, I think the fact that we're looking at ethical issues and where things are coming from, I think with fashion being so fast, we're not looking at the cycle of fashion. Where does it actually come from? We're so removed from it. That's why a book like that is so important, because people are kind of brought back to the cycle of, people were so close to that before, their sewing machine, making something. You actually saw the cycle from the beginning to the end. Maybe you spun the wool, maybe you knitted it. And because everything is produced in different countries and things like that, we're very removed from it. And I think there's a focus because we want it. We want to know where products are made, but also we can't keep going at the rate we're going.
Hello.
So I have just a quick question about something you touched on earlier, and about style. So how does, as fashion cycles and goes through cycles and changes, how does that interact with style?
I think, well, it's a huge area of discussion. I think we fundamentally, or most people fundamentally, don't fully understand the difference between style and fashion. And I think actually, if you just bring it back to that, and like a very simple definition for me of fashion for me is big business that is constantly changing, that is constantly renewing itself, that is constantly kind of exploding and imploding to reinvent itself, because it's what keeps it moving forward and it's what keeps it moving it. Style, on the other hand, is something that's very much more individual, much more personal, and much more about an expression of who you are as a person. Now, most of us don't live in a world where we separate fashion and style, and most of our own personal ideas on self-expression and style are a mix of both. But actually, if you do fundamentally break them apart, they're very different. So you can live, and that's, I always think it's funny, people always reference French women and Parisian women as being so chic. French women are so chic. Why are French women so chic? Yada, yada. It's quite interesting, because actually if you look at, and this is a generalization of course, but if you look at French women, they're much more style-led than they are fashion-led.
And less mistakes then.
So they're, you can say some people would say they're less adventurous. It depends on what way you look at it, but they would have a very kind of focused idea of where they're at style-wise.
I don't think you can totally remove the two. Like, I know there's all these kind of quotes that you'll find, that Coco Chanel and Diana Vreeland, and it's things like fashion fades and style is eternal. Yeah. And obviously they're all Hallmark card quotes and things like that. But I think there is an element of that. It's like we were saying earlier, it's a cycle of like what it makes a fad, a fashion, or a classic. And sometimes things come into our being that remain for longer, like you were saying, the skinny jeans, or something that's it becomes a classic. It's something, the trench coat, we know that we're all going to look good in. So they're the kind of items or things that are timeless. I think that is style, and some people may have certain things that they know look good on them, and that's how they identify their style. But I think fashion is such a part of the modern world, and something that you can be stylish and you can be kind of timeless, but I think you always need to sort of tap in to fashion, because that means you're kind of not with the program. If you're if you see somebody that's head to toe in a look,
you can look at
and there
dates.
isn't a bit of what's going on now, you won't necessarily accept it as stylish, if you know what I mean. There always has to be a tiny little element of it. Not fashion
it is very individual, obviously, how you perceive it. And actually, I think it's quite interesting. If you look at any of the men's street style blogs, particularly in New York, any of the ones focused in New York, I've noticed a trend. They will kind of highlight men who'll go, this guy is so dapper, he rocks a particular look. But actually, if you look and you see several photos of the same chap, it seems to be he was in his heyday, let's say in, the 80s or whatever it is, and he just stuck with it. So he's just done the 80s. And now as far as all these street stylers and these street fashion photographers, they're going, this guy's so cool, he just does this thing, dressed in the 80s. Which, yeah, he is, but it's kind of the cycle as well. So the cycle, I mean, I'm sure there was a time of probably 10 or 15 years where everyone's like, we wish Johnny would ever just move on and ditch that jacket. Whereas now it's come back around. So, I mean, it's individual. Hello.
Just in relation to that, I was thinking when you were talking about the suit, when you were asking the lady why she wouldn't wear it again, often with, and maybe it's particular to women, if they wear it a second time, it almost looks like they've never given it up. Like it looks like they kind of, they still have their mullet and their runners, like, and they're 50 kind of thing. It looks like they never moved on from that era. So it's almost like they can't go back. It's almost like it is just for the younger generation.
Yeah, it's like as well. I think you don't want to ever send out that message to your style tribe or your peers or whoever that you're stuck in a rut, even though the look might look amazing on you and you still want to keep it. And you obviously know stylish people around you that will take something, but they'll have to integrate it into something now. Without.
Almost like as you get older, you almost have to be a bit more modern.
Yeah, it's more difficult as well to pull off.
It's also just an awareness, I think, and references. I mean, you can still wear that, and like there are obviously women who will wear that look, but they will make it much more. They'll borrow maybe little things from today. It's just a nod. So there's it's a fine line between looking kind of dated and current, but looking current and not necessarily looking on trend or following fashion. There was someone put their hand up there a few minutes ago. On this side, no? Hello. They've got a microphone there for you.
Why do you think there's more women's fashion than men's fashion?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Who wants to take that one?
I think that's over to you, Darren.
Well, if I was in control of it, I'd flip it on its head and we'd have more men than women. I think it kind of comes back to what we were saying earlier on about, women. For starters, right now, it seemed much more acceptable for women to wear trousers, dresses, skirts, short. Like there's just such an array and selection of different styles to begin with that women can wear. And also, I think it has to do with as well that women generally shop more and spend more money in clothes. So it's kind of economics, and they're going, right, well, we know women will buy clothes and these clothes will sell and shift quicker than they will in men's. I mean, that's my take on it. I don't know if that's a fact, but that's would you agree?
I think there's a few different aspects. One is that it hasn't always been that way. And if you look back over time, men's fashions at a time were as important or more important than women's, if you want to go back hundreds of years or whatever. So it isn't always the case that women's fashion is more important. But also I think women tend to think of themselves as something to be adorned and to be looked at more than men. And there's seriously, I think there's more of an emphasis and expectation for women to dress and wear bright colours and so on and so forth, and to see themselves as the subject of, the gaze, just to be looked at. And there's a lot of emphasis on girls who learn that from a young age. So I think there's more emphasis and there's more pressure on women for that reason. But I think men now, increasingly over the last few decades, there's been a lot more emphasis on men also seeing themselves as a body to be adorned. So it's moving, it's changing.
It is changing.
But the emphasis has been much more on women and women's bodies.
It's still very much, you walk into a shop and, you've 3 levels of women's wear, and then hidden up in the attic in the corner, you have the men's section. But you're right, it is changing.
But also it's about the aestheticization of the woman's body. There was this lovely study on advertisements done back in the 60s, already in the 60s, and they looked at women's bodies on advertisements, just on hands, something that you'd never think about, you'd never consider. And women's hands, when they're shown on advertisements, was always the aesthetic hand. It wasn't the strong hand, the grasping hand, it was the beautiful hand. And that was how women's hands or parts of their bodies were shown, whereas when it's a man's hand, it shows strength. And he was trying to look at something very insignificant to make a point about how we view the body, the woman's body and the man's body. And that's something that's very much pervasive, whether we like it or not.
Does that answer your question? Thank you.
They did an experiment in Paris, I think around the 80s. They put a false mirror. In other words, there were cameras behind.
Right.
Do you remember?
Yeah, a two-way mirror.
Anyway, and it turned out that there was a vast number, the vast number of people stopping to look at themselves were men.
Yeah.
Men, not women. A lot more.
Oh,
When you're saying that women like to be adored, you could say that men adore themselves.
So there was more men than women.
More men stopping and taking their comb out and sort of. And
It was all for you ladies, though, ultimately.
Just in that time, which was an unusual finding.
Interesting. Very good. Have we any other questions? We've probably time for one or two more questions. Hello.
I just wanted to ask, because you both worked as stylists, I suppose the whole conversation has been about how fashion is a matter of a personal statement or an extension of the self. And obviously with the kind of current, sorry, it's really loud, celebrity culture and how we're just bombarded with, I suppose celebrities, these people are kind of hailed as fashion icons, but behind the scenes, behind them are stylists. So I suppose they're projecting these images, encouraging this mass production of clothes and this big industry. And I suppose how much responsibility do you feel having been behind the scenes, creating these images?
Interesting. It kind of depends what way you take it. I mean, I think if you're working to style an individual, regardless of what it is that individual does or what effect it's going to have, you still have to style for that person. You can't, I certainly couldn't style trying to predict the knock-on effect. Does that make sense? Like, so, it always comes back to the individual. And for me, the most important thing about clothes and the people who wear them is that they are comfortable in them. And by comfortable, I don't just mean physically comfortable, but also that they are at ease. And I think, we've all seen cases of celebrities who are wearing the most on trend, the most fashion forward clothes, and on paper it should be fantastic, but they just can't carry them off, so it's a disaster. So it's a much more subtle difference than literally just saying, okay, Simone Rocha is amazing right now, we're going to put you in Simone Rocha, therefore you will be amazing, therefore everyone's going to want to look like you. Because if you can't work Simone Rocha or really feel just not at ease, it's not going to work. So it has to be, the focus has to be on the individual, what works for them. Not necessarily saying you make it easy for them, but it's you work together with them so that you find the middle ground that they're happy with and that you're happy with, and that's functional. So, I mean, obviously, if someone's a performer, or if someone's going on TV, or if someone is speaking in front of a large audience, there are different requirements.
I think as well, the kind of rise of the stylist as a celebrity has brought into the mind's eye and into magazines and into the consumer, the customer. We know what a stylist is, but a stylist in some ways has always existed. Like if you think of really big style icons, let's say in the 40s and 50s, maybe not always existed, but if you think of Hollywood as a big era for style icons, they would always have had like incredible costume designers really styling their look, or worked with big designers like Audrey Hepburn with Givenchy. So there's always been an element of somebody dressing an icon and kind of creating the icon. And obviously that's the same today, but we're just aware of who the person is, where maybe in the past it was we didn't know much. We just thought Grace Kelly was absolutely incredible and she had a great wardrobe, We didn't know who was inventing that. Mm-hmm.
But it also puts added pressure on the person who's doing it, obviously, because if it flops, it's associated with your name. So, any other questions? Hi. Do you want to pass the mic up there, please? Thanks.
I had a question about the instigators of cycles. Like in the past, when fashion cycles were a bit slower, you had like 2 seasons, and it was the style for each season was more set. There was people behind the scenes, like, the Anna Wintours or whatever, deciding, okay, well, this is what's going to be the colour or the trend or whatever for the next season. Whereas now you see there's about 20 different styles on the runway, and which one is going to become the biggest fashion, which one is going to be chosen, is kind of a bit more uncertain, I think. And because the Zaras and H&Ms are putting things out every 6 weeks, you've got a lot more choice. So is it a case where, do you see that the idea of cycles sort of melding into disappearance almost with the internet and with the kind of rapidness of how fast shops are putting the styles out there?
There's kind of a flow. There's a trickle up and trickle down. I don't know if that's quite a cycle. Maybe it is. It's of the fact that obviously fashion came from the top tiers, the top magazines making decisions and reporting about what they saw in fashion presentations or fashion shows, and that dictating what the trends were. But now there's obviously this surge from the street coming up to meet that. But I think it's a kind of combination of both coming together. I mean, the speed, I don't think we can keep going, accelerating. We're very, very fast already. And like one of the audience mentioned earlier, that we don't maybe have the resources to continue at that speed. So I don't think it's going to keep going fast. Who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows? But I don't think so.
I just think you've got overlapping cycles. So you've got the kind of the mega cycle, which could be, your skinny jeans, for instance, which is going across a decade or whatever. Then you've got kind of smaller cycles in that. So let's say it's a color trend is a cycle. So, pastels, and they might have a lifespan that's maybe a year or 2 years. And then within that, again, you might have a much more faddish cycle or a much more quicker cycle, which is going to come and go as quick as it did. And that could be neon clutches. So, so you've got crossover, you've absolutely got crossover, but you find as well, as much as the high street can react and can replicate what they've seen on the catwalk so quick, it's also been influenced, as Ruth said, by, what we're seeing online, blogs, what we're seeing in other countries. I mean, it was the streets of Tokyo. Now the focus is very much, the coolest place to cool watch or cool spot is the streets of Seoul. And what the kids over there are doing. So it's more to do with how they're wearing the garments rather than the actual garments themselves in oftentimes. And the other thing is, though, a lot of designers, there is this constant pressure to continually produce new product. And how they're doing it is, okay, you've got seasons 2 a year, and then, so you've got summer, spring, summer, you've got autumn, winter, then you've got, pre-spring, summer, some of them, and you have beachwear, and that's the kind of resort collections. So already they've stretched it to nearly possibly 3-4 collections a year, but what they're doing is most of them, if they haven't already started, they're starting accessories lines, because you can continually change your accessories, and it's much easier and quicker to get the market, and you're not just relying on what you've seen on the catwalk. And that's kind of how you can, as someone who wants to update their look, and I think that's a really important thing as well, is it's not about constantly going out and changing your wardrobe every season, because, I mean, A, who can afford that? And B, who wants to be such a slave to fashion that that's what you do? Because invest in the wrong thing and you've just wasted a whole lot of money. But, accessories, literally a pop of colour in a bag, or earrings, or socks, whatever it is, can just carry you over. Have we any other questions? I think we're coming to the end. Hello. Hi.
Just a comment about trend forecasting, because this is a big business, of course. Trend forecasting, you might be able to comment on it better. It's not trend setting, it's, I suppose, collecting the ideas, but knowing what will become stylish and fashionable. Mm-hmm. And even fashion houses and designers, I'm sure they follow that, and people like that pay big money to know. So in a way, trend forecasting is a big business, but also it follows the cycle, some sort of a cycle, because these people are able to predict trends, not to set them necessarily, mm-hmm. but to predict.
Yeah,
so
it's
just
absolutely,
something like
it's huge business. Trend forecasting is massive business. I mean, there are massive organizations, global organizations, such as one of them is WSGN, who basically compile data. And they look to the streets, they look to the catwalks, they look online. I mean, Pinterest, you would be surprised if you realized how much people are taking lead from things like Pinterest. which are obviously social media sites, and they're collating all this information, and they are looking for common threads, and from then they are compiling what they predict are going to be the big trends. And that's what then the retailers are looking at. It's what designers to a certain extent are looking at. But like, for example, the Pantone colour this year of the year is emerald green. It's one of the particular Pantones. So straight away they're saying, well, here's one of our trends, it's a colour. So it's kind of like they kind of cross over. So it could be a colour trend, it could be you know, a trend that's happening on the streets. I mean, I know all the high street buying teams, like Pennies, Dunn's, as well as kind of watching what's going on the catwalks. They're also doing buying trips, and they're going to places like Miami for summer. They're going to, you know, South Korea, Japan, and they're actually going at the beginning of each season to see what is actually happening there. And they will go with kind of a rough idea of where they want to go with it based on what they've seen online happening across the place. What they've seen on the catwalks, and then they go and look in the streets. And they're not necessarily replicating it exactly, but they're looking, kind of going, right, all these cool kids on the streets of, you know, I don't know, these cool districts in Japan are wearing such and such. We've seen a common thread, so we're going to interpretate that. And that's kind of how it works. I mean, it's not a science. If it was, you know, if it was...
New ideas.
Yeah.
I think as well, like, trends are what's happening now or just coming into being. And trend forecasting kind of goes back a little bit to what Pauline was saying, that like you're really looking at culture. What are people doing? What do they want? How do they feel? And like the recession is a really good example to kind of go, what are people feeling right now, and what kind of fabrics and colours and things do they want around them? And that's kind of sometimes the basis of how people put together and forecast trends along with other exciting things that are happening around the world.
Any other questions? That's all we have time for. Thank you very much to Ruth, Pauline, and from myself. Thank you all for being here, and round of applause. And of course, thank you to the Science Gallery and all the staff, Sean, Diane, and everyone else. And Trinity Fashion Society.